Joining us now, Democratic Senator Chris Murphy, who represents Connecticut. Really good to have you. I got a question about this DOJ department, and first off, Jared Moskowitz of Florida has joined in, and Rahm Emanuel was on with Ezra Klein talking about what Democrats need to do going forward, and he said if the Republicans are proposing something to shake up the status quo, the Democrats should get on board and offer their own opinions, offer their own ideas, their own ways to do it, get them in the soft underbelly, as Rahm Emanuel says. Is this something that you would be interested in getting involved with? You're a guy who thinks the Democrats should be running against the status quo as well.
Yeah, I'm just not sure that this has anything to do with breaking up the status quo. You've put a billionaire who basically has made his fortune off of government subsidies in charge of deciding how the government should spend its money. This sounds like either a con job in which Elon Musk comes out of this with his programs protected and perhaps his competitors' programs targeted, or just a TV show. I mean, I've been part of these things in the past with Donald Trump. After the Parkland shooting, I got dragged over to the White House for a television program in which Donald Trump pretended he cared about guns. He didn't do anything. This may be the same thing, that he's trying to put on a show that he cares about cutting government, but actually we're going to end up with the same thing that happened in his first term. Deficits exploding, more and more debt saddled upon the American public. So yes, I think Democrats should put on the table how we think we can cut government. Let's come after the drug companies, let's come after the insurance companies, the big defense companies that are all reaping huge amounts of money off of the government. Let's come after Elon Musk, who's made his fortune off of taxpayers. Democrats should be involved in the conversation about government efficiency. I just don't know that this group has anything to do with actual meaningful common sense cuts. It may be about protecting billionaires from those cuts, or it may just be about a publicity stunt.
So Donald Trump, I wonder what you've learned over the past 8 years with the first Donald Trump presidency and then Biden following up, and Donald Trump coming back. He's appointing all of these inexperienced people to lead these very important agencies, arguing that he's got a mandate from the public to blow things up because the status quo doesn't work. How do Democrats position themselves? Because last time around, what they did was to say, we got to defend our institutions. We got to make sure that they can hold against somebody like this. And it turns out that enough of the American public said, I don't like the institutions. I'd rather put the guy in charge of, the guy who says he wants to shake everything up, blow everything up in charge, rather than go on with the same old, same old.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, Katie. What essentially was the tentpole of the Harris campaign? It was the preservation of democracy. That's why somebody like Liz Cheney campaigned with the vice president in the closing days, not because they aligned on foreign policy, not because they aligned on domestic economic policy, but because they both supported democracy. The problem is it appeared as if we were in support of the existing democracy that is like not working for anybody in this country. It has just been used to protect elites, cultural and economic elites, for the past 2 decades. When I first got involved in politics, one of the most important things Democrats stood for was government reform, campaign finance reform, getting lobbyist money out of politics, ethics reform. That's like number 9, 10, 11 on our list these days. We have to be attacking institutions, the institutions that people hate. And one of them is the existing version of democracy. The only way you preserve democracy is by reforming it. So we just have to be loud again about the ways that we would change democracy to take the corporations out of control and put people in control. We have to attack the economic institutions and be very transparent about not just small changes around the edges, like a different way to negotiate prescription drug prices, but price regulation, price caps on drugs, something simple that people can understand. I just don't think we've done a good enough job of talking about the ways that we would destroy or reform institutions, and we have unfortunately become the party of the status quo. That's got to change.
A little bit like Bernie Sanders when you're talking about price caps. I think you're hitting on something really interesting, because the sense that I get from people that I know in a variety of sectors is that they don't feel like they value they're valued any longer within this economy, that there are a couple of very rich people at the top who own big corporations, who employ a lot of us, and that we're all exchangeable. They can get rid of us tomorrow. We don't really matter. So much of our lives are controlled by a handful of people, whether it's social media or the corporations that control our food or the corporations that control what we consume, television. It's so much power concentrated in such a small number of people. How do you break that up? You're talking about going after neoliberalism, which is defined us for the past 60 years. How exactly do you change something that has now become so ingrained in not just our society, but the global order?
Yeah, I think we've been presented with this false choice between market fundamentalism, right? Almost no regulation of the market, the belief that everything the market does will eventually be good for us, and socialism, right? There is something in between, vaguely sort of thought of as common good capitalism, right? Capitalism where we make sure that the rules value workers just as much as we value shareholders, in which we decide that there are some parts of our economy, like maybe the healthcare economy, that shouldn't just be subject to profit and commoditization. And I think that that's the winning argument for Democrats, because there are a lot of folks out there who want to preserve capitalism, but think that workers should matter more than shareholders do. And I think that there is a big lane that Democrats can run through, especially because Trump is populating his cabinet with market fundamentalists, with people who are going to deregulate the economy, who are just going to pass another round of tax cuts for billionaires, millionaires, and corporations. We've got to convince folks that we can preserve the free market, but rein it in so that luck matters a little bit less. A small business has a chance to succeed. And if you work for a living, you don't have to work 70 hours a week in order to be able to provide for your family.
So I wonder what that means you do. And I've got a couple of questions on that. One on the appointments that Donald Trump is making and the nominations for his cabinet. He's putting a lot of people into positions, like RFK Jr., who doesn't have experience running a health agency, has some very dangerous ideas when it comes to vaccines, but is also seen as somebody who, is saying not so inaccurate things about our food supply and big agriculture. What do you do when faced with trying to decide who to get on board with and who to push back against, so that you personally don't look like somebody who's defending the status quo?
Yeah, I want iconoclasts to be involved in government, but I don't want there to be iconoclasts who are going to get my neighbors killed.
Yeah.
And I just think that's the bottom line. I think RFK Jr. says some things that make sense, but some of his views are so dangerous, like taking the fluoride out of our water or not vaccinating our kids, that his candidacy is going to put the people I live with at risk. I think the American people sort of understand the sort of limits here. They want folks who are going to think outside of the box, but they don't want people in government who have no idea how to run government and who are so far out of the mainstream that it ends up putting us all in danger.
What about in terms of legislation going forward? Is there, you've tried to work with the other side. You were on the immigration bill. You were the Democratic negotiator for it. Didn't end up going anywhere. You've also tried to work with Senator J.D. Vance, who's going to be the vice president. Is there legislation that you anticipate being able to work with Republicans on over the next 2 to 4 years?
Well, that's all dependent on the sort of upfront question of whether we have a democracy 6 months from now. I can't work across the aisle if Democrats are being thrown in jail, if our independent media is being intimidated into submission. So I'm a little bit more red alert than some of my other colleagues are when it comes to his nominee to be Attorney General, Kash Patel heading to the FBI. I think Donald Trump is getting ready to try to bludgeon his political opposition into submission, to convince companies like Comcast to sell off their assets that might dare question him, to get the billionaires that own media platforms to suppress dissent. So I will be at the table, as I always have been, to try to do bipartisan deals. But you can't do that if we don't have a democracy. And I just don't accept that we're going to be under normal political circumstances. The first task in January, February, and March may be making sure that we have a free and open democracy for the next 4 years.
You wrote a memo to your fellow Democrats talking about how they need to reposition themselves going forward as going against corporations and the billionaire class. How has that memo been received?
I mean, I think there's, I think I'm a little bit of a skunk in the garden party because, A, there still are a lot of neoliberals in the Democratic Party who think that the market properly but slimly adjusted on the market, on the margins, can work for people. Attacking power is not easy for everybody in the Democratic Party because we have become a party that is dependent on high-income elites. And second, I'm arguing to make our party a bigger tent. I actually think that we should be willing to bring into our coalition people that don't agree with us on every social and cultural issue, as long as they do agree with us on that economic tentpole, breaking up concentrated power, raising the minimum wage, putting workers before shareholders. That's uncomfortable for this coalition as well, because we've become used to applying a dozen different litmus tests on choice, on gay rights, on climate, on guns. I think we've got to build the coalition. So, yes, I've had a bunch of people come into my office in the last few weeks, Democrats in the Senate and in the House, who are interested in doing what I'm talking about, big tent populism. But it's still a little countercultural in a party that has gotten a little complacent and a little bit too judgmental.